It's a privilege to be playing hockey when the weather's hot, and by the look of the sweat forming on my face, it is conference final time. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Theory of Hockey show for this week. I am your host, Nick Zararis. Theory of Hockey is the home of both Do You Know Puck and The Journey, the official trivia games of the Theory of Hockey Network, where you can test your hockey knowledge against other users and me, who we're calling the Puzzle Master, even though that's an absurd title to go by in the 21st century. At theoryofhockey.com is where you can find our games, where the portfolio is growing. We have more games on the way as we continue to grow the site. It has been really rewarding to see everybody getting involved and the users continue to stabilize and on occasion grow. We get a good spike every now and then when a new person stumbles upon it and shares it with their friends. On today's show, we are going to preview the two conference finals matchups. We'll talk a little bit about the coaching chicanery between Vegas, Edmonton, Toronto. The Devils announced they're going to hold on to Sheldon Keefe. We'll talk there. We'll talk a little bit about my New York Rangers, unfortunately. But to starting out west, Colorado and Vegas, two of the better franchises of the 2020s, of this decade. Vegas and Colorado have really cemented themselves as perennial contenders. These are two teams that have shown a real willingness over the last handful of years to continue to push the envelope, to be aggressive. And although Colorado, since winning the Stanley Cup in 2022, hasn't really gotten back to that level, they have remained aggressive over an extended period of time, whether it's trading a former fourth overall pick in Bowen Byram or it's trading Casey Middlestad. They have gone a number of ways to try and get better. And you have watched over the last year and change as they have gone all in on trying to reorient this group around that late 20s, early 30s contingent. And the moves over the last 2 years, they remake the goalie room on the fly last year. They go and get Mackenzie Blackwood and Scott Wedgwood. They remake their goalie room on the fly. Then up front, last year you get Brock Nelson. This year you get Nazem Kadri. You get a fully returned to close to full speed Gabriel Landeskog. You get a relatively healthy Valeri Nichushkin. And everything gels. You get the second season, first full season of Marty Necas as a member of the Avalanche. And all of the pieces for Colorado have started to fit together. And there's no way around it. Colorado has been brutally dominant. Through the first two rounds, Minnesota made them win one time. Minnesota won a single game. They got the Kings out of there in 4. I know we're going to talk about Carolina later, who has swept both of their series, and you can make an argument has been more dominant. But I think the quality of competition Colorado has faced, in particular, getting through Minnesota in 5, more impressive. And I think the high-end talent on Colorado is just better. And that's ultimately why I think you're going to start to pick up on the sense of my themes here on this episode. But Colorado, the last couple of years, has gotten the raw end of the deal. They lost in a Game 7 last year where they had Mikko Rantanen go crazy on them against Dallas. The year after they won the Stanley Cup, they lose in 7 to the Kraken in that first-round series. But Colorado's been around the periphery. They've had some depth issues. They've lost a number of guys over the last handful of years. That's the nature of salary caps in hockey. You know, they lost Kadri in free agency. Gabriel Landeskog hadn't played much of the last few seasons. Valeri Nichushkin has had a number of injuries and the off-the-ice stuff. There's been a litany of issues. Their goaltending has been a revolving door of problem for them for much of this decade. You think about leading up to them finally breaking through and winning the Stanley Cup with Darcy Kemper. They have guys like Pavel Francois playing in conference final games as recently as a handful of years ago. And the last 24 months have represented as good a push as you can watch one franchise make. And I think now we're at a point where if Colorado doesn't at least make the Stanley Cup final, then I think you're going to have some awkward and some frustrating conversations, to say the least. Now, I think if you make the conference final, you have reasonably achieved a successful season. Being that there are 32 teams in our league and only one team can win the Stanley Cup, if you are one of the final 4 teams standing, I think by most accounts you would consider that a success. But by virtue of Colorado being far and away the best team in the regular season, where they had a playoff spot effectively clinched in January, the way they were able to build up such a point cushion so fast, the way they were able to go out and shore up some of their depth questions by going out and getting Nazem Kadri in particular, who will hone in on as far as their power play goes. Their power play was probably the one weak point of the team in the regular season and has been significantly better in the postseason. Now, on the Vegas side of things, Vegas is a really interesting team in that they've been around the periphery for a few years now. They go out in the second round 2 years in a row. They look like a team that is over the hill. They're a little bit old. They haven't really found the right new mix of guys. You think about the team that went on the great heater in 2023. They win the Stanley Cup. They solidify themselves as the best expansion team in arguably the history of the league, at least in a contemporary sense. If you want to go into that WHA and the mergers and the stuff in the 80s where the Oilers are technically an expansion team, fine, I'll give you that. But by virtue of the contemporary era, Florida, Minnesota, Columbus, Seattle, Vegas has really zeroed in on the ruthless efficiency of building a contender. And they are a team where you could have made the argument things were getting stale for them this year. And what I will say in defense of Bruce Cassidy, who we'll talk about more in that Edmonton segment later on, Bruce Cassidy had the single worst goaltending season of his coaching life this year, and that's what got him fired. I don't necessarily think the Golden Knights were going to go on some great run if they had kept Bruce Cassidy, but I do think that great quote, I think it's Scotty Bowman from way back in the day, show me a fired coach, I'll show you a bad goalie. Show me a good coach, I'll show you a good goalie. I think that holds true here because you looked at the goaltending that the Golden Knights were getting from Carter Hart, from Adin Hill throughout the course of the season. It was terrible in the regular season. Some of the bottom five goaltending in the entire league from a team that had reasonable expectations. And let's think about the last few years for Vegas, the moves they've gone out and made. They go out and they get Tomas Hertl. They go out and they get Noah Hannafin. They go out and get Rasmus Anderson. That's all an augmentation of the Jack Eichel, Ivan Barbashev, Mark Stone core, the holdovers from the group that won the cup a couple of years ago. You think about losing that veteran leadership and those intangibles of Alex Pietrangelo, who one of the few guys who has won a Stanley Cup as captain on multiple teams, plays the number one minutes-eating defenseman, and how the Golden Knights have gone about it. And one of the great ironies of the Vegas Golden Knights, before we get into their narratives, this is a team, and I wrote about this on the Theory of Hockey Substack last week, Vegas has consistently found ways to move on from guys when it's time. Vegas is a team very much like the conversations you heard from much of the 2000s and the 2010s about the Bill Belichick Patriots. The thing that made Belichick look smarter than everyone else back then was his willingness to move on from players who were not completely washed. The great example, Chandler Jones obviously goes on and has a very nice back half of his career in Arizona before his mental health really takes a toll and he spirals and he's out of the league probably a little bit earlier than you would expected. Richard Seymour went on and had a nice run post his time with the Patriots. But for the most part, what made Belichick smart was his willingness to walk away from guys, even if they had a year or two of effectiveness left, and said, I don't want to be stuck with year 3, 4, 5. And you go and look at Vegas over the duration of their franchise's history and their willingness to cut ties with guys, to free up cap space, to increase maximum fluidity or liquidization, if you prefer the market term. That is what has made Vegas a perennial contender in the 9 years of their existence. You think about the fact this team has been to the conference finals in half the seasons it's been in the NHL. They've only missed the playoffs one time in their 9 seasons of existence, and that was the year they traded for Eichel. And he basically didn't play until February or March because that was the year he got the disc replacement surgery in his neck. The only guy Vegas has really gotten burned on, ironically, is Adin Hill. After they won that Stanley Cup in 2023, the Vegas Golden Knights gave Adin Hill the generic starting goalie contract, that 5-6 years between $5 and $7 million. It's a reasonable amount of money for a starting caliber goalie, but at no point in Adin Hill's career had he ever really established himself as a consistent 50 to 60 start guy who can be relied on. And that's not to diminish winning a Stanley Cup, playing majority of the games. Yes, did he take that role from Laurent Brossoit, somebody who got injured along the way? Did Jonathan Quick get into a couple playoff games? Yes, all of that is true. But you also had all of the other players Vegas has looked at and said, you know what, we're good. Whether it's Marc-Andre Fleury, Max Pacioretty, those are the two that really come to mind. Their willingness to trade Riley Smith away, their willingness to let Jonathan Marchessault leave in free agency, their willingness to trade somebody like Nick Suzuki, who very clearly is one of the 10 best centers in the NHL now. Granted, the Golden Knights weren't interested in waiting for Nick Suzuki to develop, which is why they traded for Max Pacioretty in the first place. You are watching Vegas largely become a Frankenstein monster of mishmash parts. And what makes Vegas compelling is this looked like a team that was maybe past its prime, a team that maybe you could say things were stale, they needed to shake things up trade, and they broke out the fire the coach move with 8 games left. Basically unprecedented. The Devils did it 20-ish years ago. They fired their coach. They, of course, went on to win the Stanley Cup that year. That's obviously your best case scenario. Under John Tortorella, they closed out the regular season 7-0-1. They're 8-4 so far in the playoffs. They lost 2 games each in the Utah and Anaheim series, respectively. Both Utah and Anaheim were able to give Vegas real problems with speed, with transition, and Vegas hasn't really found the ideal way to play. I was talking about this with one of my friends on Saturday leading into the weekend. We were looking forward to that Montreal Buffalo game, and we were talking about it in the sense that Vegas has never really been comfortable in their games. And that's a very anecdotal frame of reference for what a Stanley Cup winning team looks like. But when you are consistently dictating the tempo, the control of the game for extended periods of time, that generally is going to translate to team success. And Carolina and Colorado have done the best job of any 2 teams in this playoff of dictating the games, dictating the tempo, the style, how the game is going to be played. And if we happen to lose the way Colorado lost 1 game to Minnesota, that's okay. We can live with that. But the greater sample says we are doing our jobs. Vegas, on the other hand, it's been a lot of counterpunch. It's been a lot of reaction. And there's nothing disqualifying about that. Same way, we're going to talk about Montreal later, previewing the Eastern Conference Final. Montreal's been on their heels a lot in these playoffs. They have withstood some serious surges, some serious pushes, but your goalie is part of the team. And having Jakub Dobeš be an elite goalie in the playoffs counts. That is not to disqualify what makes Montreal good. Is it challenging to win the way Montreal plays? Yes, very much so. Can you continue to bank on Alex Newhook being your leading goal scorer if you're going to win the Stanley Cup? Almost assuredly not. But I do want to see how far this can go, because what Montreal is doing has an air of magic to it. And that's what makes the Stanley Cup playoffs so special, is you can have a role player go on a crazy surge. And the same conversation we've had about Taylor Hall for 2 straight weeks for Carolina, you could apply that same precipice to that same point, I should say, to what we just said about Alex Newhook. So in the playoffs so far, the Avalanche have outscored opponents 23-12 at 5-on-5, a 64% goal share, and they're doing that on a 64% expected goal share. So yes, they are not going to continue to score at a 64% clip. That would be batshit. Vegas had a 66% goal. They outscored opponents 66-33 at 5-on-5 when they won the Stanley Cup back in 2023. This would be as dominant an even strength team has won the Stanley Cup in the Cup era. When you think about it, 2.5 goals per game at even strength. They're conceding a couple power plays per game. That's really the only knock I have on Vegas. That is really the only knock I have on Colorado. The fact they are conceding 3 power plays against per game, it's a little on the high end, and maybe that goes down the deeper you go into the playoffs. Referees generally have more active whistles in the earlier rounds of the playoffs, and as these series go along, we see a real reticence to get involved unless they absolutely have to. Colorado's power play is running at 25%. They're getting about 2.5 power plays per game. That is significantly better than in the regular season. It's about 8-9 points better for their season-long average. The power play took a noticeable improvement once Nazem Kadri arrived post-deadline. Not a surprise if you remember Kadri's role on that power play unit all those years ago when they won the Cup. In that high danger slot area, we know Kadri's ruggedness, his physicality, his willingness to take on contact, to dish out contact, and really be a high-end middle sixer. And that's one of the real interesting components of this series is the middle parts of both of these lineups on paper can go mano-y-mano. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But on the Vegas side of things, a lot worse at even strength. They're a dead even 50-50, 25 goals for, 25 goals against at 5-on-5, 51% expected goal share. So you could say they're underperforming their expected goals ever so slightly. 53% of the high danger chances. They're only getting 2.08 goals per game. Colorado is averaging almost a full half goal per game more at even strength. Their shooting percentage, 9.7. Their save, 907.1 at even strength. Modestly worse than what Colorado's getting. Colorado's at 922.6 at 5-on-5 save percentage, and then a 10.13 shooting. So Colorado's getting better results, and they're getting a little bit more luck because of it. That's why I like to say you make your own luck. When you think about this series, the Stars can make this compelling, and that is going to be Vegas's best case scenario. So McKinnon has outscored opponents 8-3, 60% goal share, 53% of the high dangers. Great work. Necas playing largely with McKinnon, 9-2 goals for and against. The Avalanche have 17 different players who have scored at least one goal, including Brett Kulak, who scored the overtime game winner against Minnesota to close out that series. Colorado has 10 players with at least 2 goals, and Colorado only has 4 players with a negative even strength goal share. That's Ross Colton, Logan O'Connor, and then Blankenberg, guys who have not played every single playoff game. Vegas, Eichel has outscored opponents 13-9, 53% expected goal share, 52% high dangers. So that number is a little high. He's gotten a little bit more of a positive goal share than you would expect based on his underlying numbers. But because Jack Eichel is one of the 5-10 best centers in the league, his capacity to outplay his metrics is a little more realistic or tangible, if you will, than some of the other guys we might talk about. Somebody I'm going to hone in on that I think is an X factor, if you will, somebody I talked about going into that first round series against Utah. That's Tomas Hertl. Hertl has largely been the third line center on this team in these playoffs. He's been outscored 4-1, so negative goal share, but he's got a 57% 57% expected goal share and 62% high danger chance share. Those numbers would lead you to believe Hertl is capable of a little bit more, and that's an opportunity here. And the two guys for Vegas that you need to know, and if you've been watching the playoffs, you know, because Dorofeev and Brett Howden have the most goals on this Golden Knights team. Between Dorofeev and Brett Howden, those two have 38% of all the Vegas goals in these playoffs. Dorofeev has 9, Howden has 8. Vegas has scored 44. So we're talking 39% of the goals in the entirety of the playoffs, even strength, special teams, what have you. Two guys, 39%. And it's not Eichel, it's not Marner, it's not Stone. It is Pavel Dorofeev and Brett Howden. That's what makes Vegas compelling. If you want to make the case that Vegas can win this series, it is largely going to be based on the idea that their stars, who have not been slam dunk lights out through the first 2 rounds of the playoffs, have room to play better in augmentation, in support of these depth guys who have played really good hockey so far. If you want to make the case for Vegas, that's your argument. If you think that Tomas Hertl, if you think that Jack Eichel, if you think that Mitch Marner, Mark Stone, if you think those guys, the best players, at least based on track record and reputation, can weigh a series at this point in their respective careers, then you have a chance. And the argument for Vegas is that they are probably the only team in maybe the entire league who, if you go Eichel versus McKinnon, McKinnon's better, but Eichel is within spitting distance. If McKinnon is the second or third best center in the league, Eichel's what, the 5th or 6th? Eichel is one of the few guys who can skate as well as McKinnon. McKinnon is faster, but Eichel is one of the 5-10 best skating centers in the league. He's got a long reach. He has made real strides in his defensive game since Bruce Cassidy, now departed Bruce Cassidy, got there. I think that's an opportunity. You go down the middle. While Bill Karlsson, who has been great in these playoffs since drawing into the lineup against either Nelson or Kadri, whichever center happens to be there, and then Hertl versus Kadri or Nelson, it's close. I can make an argument that Tomas Hertl is probably the most physically talented of all 4 of those middle 6 centers. He hasn't played like it. And I should qualify that. He hasn't produced like it. I have always been a fan of Hertl's game. I think he has had a really funky career in the sense that the talent has never really yielded the results you would expect based on what he can do from an underlying numbers perspective. But I think the center matchups make this an interesting series. I think Colorado's real advantages are in net and on the back end. Well, I think Shea Theodore is really good. I think Hannafin and Rasmus Anderson are really respectable number 2 and number 3 defensemen. None of these guys are close to what Makar can do. And you saw what Colorado was able to do to Minnesota with Quinn Hughes, with Brock Faber, Brodin, Spurgeon, those defensive stalwarts. Minnesota's calling card, basically any time post 2010 has been defense, and Bill Guerin has oriented that team around Hughes and Faber, and Colorado was able to make short work of them, and those guys skate better than any defenseman on Vegas. I think Colorado is the best team in the league. I think Colorado at this point, if Colorado does not win the Stanley Cup, I would be genuinely surprised. They have had basically, Colorado has had as good a regular season in first 2 rounds of the playoffs as basically feasible in what our current NHL situation allows. Yes, they got the cupcake first round matchup. They pretty much stomped out Minnesota in short order in that second round. And they've had a nice little break here going into the Vegas series now. If you want to make the case for Vegas, it's Tomas Hertl, it's William Karlsson. Can those guys outplay Brock Nelson and Nazem Kadri? Can Dorofeev keep this going? Can Marner get to that next gear? I think Colorado wins this series in 6 games. I think their high-end talent is just better than Vegas's high-end talent, though I do think Vegas's depth is good enough that this can be a compelling series. I think that goaltending question, Carter Hart, does not inspire a ton of confidence, and I think Colorado has an opportunity to really set themselves up for success in a potential Stanley Cup final matchup, but I would go Colorado in 6 right now as we dive in. And now, switching over to the Eastern Conference, where we got Carolina and Montreal. Carolina, this is the 5th team in the history of the NHL to start a playoff appearance with 8 straight wins. The 85 Oilers, 69 Blues, the 60 Canadiens, and the 52 Red Wings. Of those 4 teams prior, only the 69 Blues did not win the Stanley Cup. This is the most aggressive forechecking team in the league. This is the highest tempo. This is the most aggressive offensive zone team in our sport today. They are a buzzsaw that plays smothering hockey. Now, if you're worried that a 10, 11-day layoff might be a problem for them, I do think that's realistic. I do think they have some work to do as far as getting back up to game speed, but if anybody can get that out of his group, I would bet it's Rod Brind'Amour. This is the 4th time with Rod Brind'Amour as head coach, the Carolina Hurricanes have made the Eastern Conference Finals. In their previous 3 trips, they were swept twice and they lost in 5 once. This is a team that has met glass ceiling after glass ceiling, and because of who they've played in those conference finals, whether it's Boston, whether it's Washington, whether it's Tampa, Florida, the Rangers, whoever Carolina's run into that has stopped them short of the ultimate goal, they've just had better high-end guys. And that's not a knock. You know, when we tell the story of this era 15, 20 years from now, Sebastian Aho is going to be on a lot of top 10 and 15 for statistical categories. He's been pretty close to a point per game player for 7 or 8 years now on a really good regular season team. And you put up those many counting stats, maybe you win a silver or a bronze medal at an Olympics, a World Cup of Hockey perhaps, or another in-season tournament. You have a conversation maybe down the road. Sebastian Aho ends up being a fringe Hall of Famer category type guy. As for Montreal, they've won 2 Game 7s in extremely improbable fashion. In the first round, they have 9 shots on goal in Game 7, and they beat Andre Vasilevsky. The other night, they beat Buffalo in a Game 7 in overtime on an Alex Newhook shot from a funky angle that just doesn't get seen. And that's the nature of the Stanley Cup playoffs. Somebody like an Alex Newhook can go on a crazy heater, elevate their team, elevate their depth. And on the note of Newhook, who we've talked about a few times now, ironically got traded for a first and a second from Colorado, what makes Montreal compelling is they've largely been on their heels through these first 2 series. They are one of the 5 bottom teams in these playoffs in terms of scoring chances. They have largely leaned on the work of Dobeš and timely situational scoring. Their star players have put up reasonable counting stats as far as goals and assists go. But when you go under the hood, you really hone in on even strength. You have watched Montreal get by on a handful of individual performances. And you look at guys like Jake Evans, he's outscored opponents 9-2, Newhook 9-3, Demidov 6-3. Newhook has 7 goals through 14 games for these Canadiens, and 29 of the 43 Montreal goals come at even strength. And then on the note of depth, I think this is where Montreal will run into issues in a way they haven't in other rounds. Is not only does Carolina have really quality depth, their depth has arguably been the best part of this team. Very similar to what Montreal itself has done, where its depth players have won the minutes and its stars have largely treaded water against the other team's best players. Taylor Hall has a 92% goal share at 5-on-5, 11-1. They've outscored opponents. Keandre Miller, 10-1. Logan Stankoven, Jackson Blake, and Taylor Hall have outscored opponents 9-1 together. And that's Montreal's second or third line, depending on the given game. I am excited to see how that middle six matchup plays out, because I think Carolina's high-end guys, Aho, Svechnikov, Jarvis, can do a reasonable enough job against Suzuki, Slafkovsky, and Caulfield that I think this series largely does ultimately get defined by the depth. And that's not exactly groundbreaking analysis, but what I think makes them compelling from just a narrative standpoint, and I do think that's what's more interesting about Carolina, Montreal than, say, Colorado, Vegas. Colorado and Vegas have both already won Stanley Cups. In recent history, too, it feels... The Avalanche winning the Stanley Cup in 2022 feels like 10 years ago at this point. I remember it about as well as I remember the Blackhawks winning the Cup in 2015, because everything starts to blur together because time moves. But on the other side, Carolina has not been to a Stanley Cup final since 2006. Montreal went to a Stanley Cup final in 2021. It is one of the great blood magic runs of all time that they were able to beat the Golden Knights in the Western Conference. I'm using in air quotes there, talking about Montreal, who was put into the Western Conference because of the COVID division alignment that year once they got out of the Canadian division after they had beat Toronto and Winnipeg. But you look at where Montreal is at very early on in their competitive window life cycle. Suzuki is the oldest player of that core contingent, and he's not 27, 28. He's still got time. Slafkovsky, Hudson, Demidov, all very early on in their cycles. Caulfield is only in his mid-20s. And they're going to get a lot of money off their books over the next couple of years between Gallagher, between Josh Anderson, between Patrick Laine. That's almost $18-20 million in cap space they're going to get. This is a team that has had luck go their way, where they've slid up in a couple lotteries. They've hit on guys like Lane Hudson, who was a second-round pick. They've accumulated assets. They've taken players on to make bad cap contracts go away for other teams. They have as close to a full coffer of picks as you can ask for. And they went out, they traded for Phil Deneau, they brought the pizza man back, somebody I've always greatly admired, who I think is a really nice tool player where you can use him in a few different roles. Montreal doesn't need to win this series. I won't say Montreal is playing with house money, because if they make the Stanley Cup final now, they are ahead of schedule. I could argue by just making the conference final that Montreal is ahead of schedule. I remember back in, I want to say it was early March, on an episode of Locked On NHL with Hunter Hodes, who hosts the Penguin Show. We were doing a hot takes episode. How hot is the take XYZ? And I had said, Montreal is going to make the conference finals, and Hunter had thought that was a pretty hot take. And back in early March, we didn't have any clarity between Montembeault, Dobeš, Jacob Fowler. We hadn't really seen Montreal get it back on the tracks. They definitely had a bit of a bumpy ride post-Olympics, but the way they have shown an ability to survive, it's very reminiscent of what we saw from the New York Rangers in the 2010s, where you're talking about a handful of really good guys who are going to get outchanced at 5-on-5, but they're going to score on their counters. You're going to get that occasional second or third liner to chip in a goal, but you are largely going to get by on your power play and on your goaltending. You look at what Jakub Dobeš, has done, and you can't not be impressed. This is his first real taste. And I know he got into playoff games last year, but it's just different when you are the guy who is driving the bus. Dobeš is 24. He turns 25 next week, May 27th. He has 59 career NHL games played. In the playoffs, he has a 9.10 and a 2.52 goals against average this year. He has faced the most shots on goal of any goalie in the playoffs this year. He's made the most saves of any goalie in the playoffs this year. He has played the most minutes of any goalie in the playoffs this year. While I'm curious to see how it ultimately shakes out for him as far as the trajectory of his career, it's hard not to feel like this is the anointing of a next guy. And Montreal still has Fowler to play with. They have David Reinbacher, who they took pretty high a couple years ago. They are in a position now where, let's say we get to summer 2027 and Connor McDavid tells Edmonton, I don't want to re-sign here. You have the bundle of assets to go get Connor McDavid to Montreal. If you look at Brady Tkachuk and you think he's your missing piece. Now, I don't think Brady Tkachuk is the missing piece there, but just say for argument's sake, if you're Montreal and you look at the Jason Robertson situation right now and you say, well, we can give you Slafkovsky, we can give you Reinbacher, we can give you Caden Gooley, we can give you another middle sixer and a couple picks. Would that be enough for Jason Robertson? And then all of a sudden you've leveled up Slafkovsky to Jason Robertson at the cost of excess value, where you already had a robust pool and you added 100-point forward to a group that already has a 50-goal guy in Caulfield and a point per game caliber guy in Suzuki. You have really entrancing possibilities if you're Montreal. And Montreal has gone about this in the exact right way. That is how you build a Stanley Cup contender. You wait, you bide your time, and when the opportunity strikes. Now, I wouldn't have made Noah Dobson one of the 5 highest paid defensemen in the NHL. I don't think he's that caliber of player. God bless him. They went out and did it anyway because they felt he could get them to another level. And this is a Montreal team that can stand to upgrade the Mike Matheson spot in their lineup. We talked before about Anderson, Gallagher, Laine. Their depth, Texier, Carey, they have a lot of depth guys who are whatevers. They're nothing burgers, and they have room to continue trading. Think about the Logan Mailloux for Zachary Bolduc trade, where Montreal already has too many defensemen. And they go and get Bolduc from St. Louis, who has fit in very nicely into their middle six and has done a really nice job in these playoffs. Now, just to put a bow on this series before we transition to the non-playoff team portions of the episode, Carolina should win this series. I would be a little surprised if Carolina did not win this series. The one thing Montreal has going for it, they have the best goalie in this series. That is no disrespect to Freddie Anderson, who has put together a really nice career. Freddie Anderson, not a Hall of Fame guy in the slightest bit. He's always been the top 10th, 11th, 12th. He's always been pretty good. He's never been great for an extended period of time, but he's had a couple of really nice seasons. He's in the later stage of his career. He's somebody who, if Carolina goes all the way this year, I could see retiring at the end of the year because his contract is up. I really like what Carolina has managed to assemble. Now, the way they did it, a little surreptitious. I think they're probably one true high-end guy short of what they would need to beat Colorado. I think Carolina could beat Vegas in a best of 7, and we'll address that should we get there. But if you're Montreal, you are going to have to get a little bit better at 5-on-5. You are not going to beat Carolina with a 39% scoring chance share. If you want to try and sit on your heels, spring the counterattack, draw penalties, you are going to have a hard time against Carolina, who is as fast as it gets, who is as smothering as it gets. We know Carolina is very aggressive on the forecheck. We know Montreal's D is not the most big. It's not the most physical. Yes, it's mobile, which does help against aggressive forechecks, but I do think Montreal is going to have real problems in this series. Montreal's path is really just Dobeš continuing to be miraculous. And we've seen Carolina struggle against the Shesterkins, the Bobrovskis, the Tuukka Rasks. It is feasible to beat Carolina on special teams and with timely 5-on-5 play, but it is going to be a challenge for a Montreal group that probably is pretty tired after 2 7-game series. The mental highs and lows, on top of the physical highs and lows, are nothing to sneeze at this point in the year. And that's why it's such an advantage when you can win your first and second round series in 6 or less. Those games, even if it's only one more, that's a lot of wear and tear on the body. And you think about the agony, the grueling tiredness. And Montreal Buffalo is not a long flight by any means, but to go 7, to go to overtime, and to get that relief. And now you got 2 days to get it back together, and you got to go play Carolina, who's been playing golf every other day for the last 10 days, because you don't want to run your guys every day. Now, they've been practicing, obviously, but you can't run practice 10 days in a row. You're going to get guys crazy. Carolina probably takes half of game 1 to get their feet under them, but more likely than not, Carolina can get their routine going, and then it becomes a matter of Montreal can withstand that pressure, withstand that barrage, and keep it close. That's the key to beating Carolina. You hang around, you make their goalie be great, you make their guys, whether that's Aho, Svechnikov, Jarvis, whatever guy you're thinking of when I say star on Carolina. When you make Carolina's best players outplay your guys. So if you're Carolina, you need Aho and Jarvis to outplay Suzuki and Caulfield. Suzuki and Caulfield have had a relatively tough go of it in these playoffs at even strength. You have a real material advantage there if you're Carolina. There are going to be chances in this series for both teams. You do not get to this point as a fluke. Even the Carolina teams that have lost in the conference finals under Brind'Amour, we talked about it before, they've had 4 or 5 of them. They've had 4 appearances. This will be their 4th upcoming, and they've only won a single game in the previous 3 trips. Those Carolina teams deserve to be there. And I know we get into the deserve to win, fair. You win the games, you advance. Are there more ethical or efficient ways to get there? Yes, of course. But when they hand out the Stanley Cup at the end of June, it's not going to say, 1 XYZ, blah, 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 expected goals, high dangers. It's going to have the names of all of the guys for all of perpetuity. You win the Stanley Cup, I don't care how unlikely it is. As much as I find the Blues to be the most outlier case that everybody seems to cite for the reason their team can go on the miraculous run, they did it. I don't think that Blues team was one of the 3 or 4 best teams that year, but they won the Stanley Cup. So by virtue of winning the cup, they get to say they were the best team that year. That's why we play the games. I love theory. I love debate. I love conversation. It's why I do this. It's why I do Locked on Oilers, Locked on NHL. It's why I've been doing hockey media stuff for so long. I find it eminently compelling to debate as a theory and an idea, but you have to go out and play the games. Like Herm Edwards said, that's what the great thing about sports. You play to win the game. It's not about trying. It is about winning. Now, pivoting conversations to non-playoff teams. Now, the Golden Knights are still in the playoffs, but the Bruce Cassidy Palace intrigue continues to develop. We had the Hockey Coaches Union, which I did not know was a thing. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know if I've ever seen a public statement from the Professional Hockey Coaches Union before, coming out and saying that while the Golden Knights are within their rights to deny Bruce Cassidy the opportunity to interview with other clubs, it's effectively unprecedented. This does not happen. Now, we have had on occasion where a team has wanted to interview a coach or a front office executive, and that person as an individual has rebuffed the offer. Chris Drury had reportedly been asked by the Sabres to interview, and he rebuffed those advances. But if Bruce Cassidy wants to coach, which he went on NHL Network last week and said, I want to coach again, for Vegas to be playing shenanigans like this is very weird. Now, you have that not talking to the media thing after winning Game 6 against Anaheim, that second-round pick being docked, that fine for John Tortorella. I think these are 2 separate things. I think if you are that convinced you want Bruce Cassidy, if you're the Oilers, I know the Devils said they're going to keep Sheldon Keefe, but let's just say the Devils, if you're the Kings. If you're a team that wants Bruce Cassidy, get Vegas on the phone, ask them what they would like. I think it's within reason to trade a 3rd, a 4th, a 5th round pick. If Vegas wants you to pay off the rest of his outstanding salary, that's fine. It's only money. I think if that's all it's going to take, I think you do it, you move on, you don't think twice about it. I think if you were the Oilers, you cannot afford to mess this up. Toronto, they need a forward-thinking coach, whether that's David Carl, the University of Denver coach who's won a couple national titles. I don't think Bruce Cassidy, I don't think anyone the Oilers hire, I should say, is going to win them a Stanley Cup, just if we're being blunt. I think they missed their best shot 2 years ago, and they are going to deal with the repercussions of failing to close out the greatest comeback in the history of hockey from 3-0 down to win in 7. They had a really good group 2 years ago, and they missed the boat. And at this point, if you're Edmonton, it is wholly and solely about convincing Connor McDavid to stay. Now, if he has a particular lean in this coaching search, I think you incorporate him into that decision-making conversation. He is not the sole factor. You do have to consider the other 17 skaters, the other 2 goalies. You have to consider everything, including the possibility that we play out the 26-7 season and Connor McDavid says to you, I don't want to sign right now. I would like to see how the start of next season plays out. Or he says, I don't want to sign here, period. And you have to navigate a potential trading of the best player in the league. I think you need to have a coach who is prepared to deal with having to reorient the team around Draisaitl. And look, love Leon. One of my favorite players in the sport, one of the best players in the sport, somebody who's going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer, one of the 5-10 best European players of all time. He is not Connor McDavid. And the trickle-down effect that has on your organization, on your fan base, that is something that we have not seen in the contemporary NHL. We've seen stars move. We've seen Tavares, the late Johnny Gaudreau, Mitch Marner. We've seen star players leave in free agency. But the best player in the world saying, I don't want to be here anymore, has basically not happened in the contemporary NHL. Now, in basketball, we saw LeBron leave multiple times. In baseball, we saw A-Rod go to free agency. He ultimately decided to stay with the Yankees, but we saw A-Rod go to free agency when he was coming off an MVP award. So it's not out of the question in the other sports, but it doesn't happen here. It does not happen in hockey where Sidney Crosby or Mario Lemieux get to free agency. Gretzky's a little bit different because he got traded a couple times, and very clearly there were more extenuating circumstances in that situation. But if you're the Oilers and McDavid says he wants Bruce Cassidy and Vegas is giving you a hard time, you'll entertain. They reportedly asked to interview Craig Berube, who I want no part of. Craig Berube has really one good coaching season under his belt. He's been a coach for 10 seasons, 2 in Philly, 2 in Toronto, 6 in St. Louis. One really great season. They win the Stanley Cup when he gets promoted in the middle of the season after they fire Mike Yeo. They go on the miracle run. They go from last place to first place, play Gloria, all that good stuff. He doesn't have a great track record other than that. His underlying numbers on his teams have always been pretty middling. He doesn't have dominant defensive strategy. His preferred style of hockey is out of favor for where the league is at right now. I think there is a very real possibility if you are the Oilers and you hire Craig Berube, you run the risk of imitating exactly what happened in Toronto. You go into next season, you have Craig Berube, you get that first year that goes reasonably okay. You probably flame out in the first or second round. And then McDavid, a la the way Mitch Marner leaves. Maybe you're able to get a little bit more in return because he has a year on his contract as opposed to Marner, who was only his UFA rights, and they were able to get Nick Waugh out of it. But if you're Edmonton and you lose McDavid, it's over. That's why you cannot afford to mess this up. There are guys out there. I'd entertain guys like Jay Leach or David Carl. I think if you're Edmonton, you need a guy who has some NHL experience. I think the fact basically only 3 guys have ever won 2 cups with different franchises as a coach tells you more likely than not, no matter who you hire, you're going to guess wrong, even if you go to a first-time guy, just because it's so hard to win a Stanley Cup. But unfortunately, as the Oilers, that is your bar. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about on today's show before I sign off and go watch the Knicks tonight, I can't keep doing this with the Rangers, man. The people who cover the team are so unbelievably full of shit all of the time. And I understand we are in the doldrums of content for teams that have been out of the playoffs or didn't make the playoffs at all. I have to do a daily podcast for the Oilers. If I can find something to talk about for 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week, for the entirety of May, you, who has sources, who has resources, You should be able to do a better job than me. All I have is Google. All I have are a couple Patreons for hockey statistics. What about Mario Ferraro would make the Rangers better? Please tell me. Can anybody tell me what Mario Ferraro would be able to do for the Rangers that somebody like Urho Vakanainen, who is as replacement level gets, would be able to do? I know Mario Ferraro's tall. I know he blocks shots. That's great. The Rangers have one defenseman who can move the puck well, and that's Adam Fox, who no one seems to like anymore because of one bad play in the Four Nations face-off 2 years ago. Adam Fox is the third or fourth best defenseman in the entire world. I don't want to hear it. This team needs 2 more defensemen, arguably 3 new top 6 forwards. The Rangers are in desperate need of an entire overhaul. It looks like they have a nice mix of guys to fill out the bottom 6. That's great. If they can turn Vincent Trocheck into a decent top 6 player, great. The Rangers need so much stuff, and people are talking, well, would you like Mario Ferraro? Well, who's going to be the backup goalie? Until they get a real first-line center and a real first-line right wing, they are not winning a thing. I like what I saw from Gabe Perreault. That was fun. It was nice to see him, Lafreniere, and Zibanejad play well. That's a second line on a good team. The Rangers basically need a whole first line, and they need a third and fourth defenseman. If you want to talk about seriously retooling, I don't want Brady Tkachuk. As much as I love Jason Robertson and I think he's a good player, the Rangers don't have the assets to go out and get a Jason Robertson. Because if you have to trade Gabriel Perreault or Lafreniere, you're taking something out of a team that was already the worst team in the East last year. Yes, Robertson is better than either of those guys, but you need more. The Rangers need so much more talent. They have such a dearth of skill. They have such a dearth of speed. They got a ton of heart. I'll give the Noah Labas and the Yaroslav Hamaleshes of the world all the credit in the world. I imagine they'll bring the Rempe experience back, even though at this point I think everybody, including Mike Sullivan, is done with it. The Rangers are going to have 9 guys to fill out 6 bottom 6 spots. I don't want to hear anything about JT Miller. I don't care that he's the captain. I don't care he won a gold medal. He was bad last year. He got a write-off because he won the gold medal and because he's Chris Drury's favorite player. The fact that the people who cover this team refuse to just come out and say Chris Drury is bad at his job and should be fired tells you all you need to know. And I don't like doing this because as somebody who has the journalism background and who doesn't do the pretend insider stuff like you watch a lot of people with a similar platform to me do, where you say, I'm hearing, like you're schizophrenic, there are a lot of people out there who purport to have sources or pretend to have sources. You read the same tweets I do. You go on the same subreddits. You read the same articles. If I can do X, Y, and Z and do the Rangers can't score, the defense is bad, Shesterkin cannot do everything himself, why can't you? I don't like getting up on the high horse, but I'm so tired of being I am so tired of anytime I read anything about the Rangers, it's, yeah, the team is terrible, but here's my niche 6th defenseman or my niche 3rd line winger. I don't want Mason Marchment. I already am dealing with enough of this crap. I'm already dealing with Will Borgen. I'm already dealing with Vakanainen. We wasted a whole year where Carson Soucy was playing when Matthew Robertson, who looked like a decent number 6 defenseman, could have been in that role. They had Calvin DeHaan on the team and exiled him for coming out and saying it's bullshit how they treated him. It's a terribly run franchise, and no one cares. No one cares. The Knicks are good. They'll spin it off into a separate stock. The Rangers will nosedive. The Knicks will do well. And James Dolan will continue to make money, and no one will care. Whatever. Maybe I should stop caring. Maybe my blood pressure would stop spiking. Maybe I'd be a little bit happier. But God, it should not be this hard to call a spade a spade. Chris Drury has done a miserable job as general manager of the Rangers, and it is an insult to fans who pay the highest price of anybody in North America per game that this is what they are being given. They're going to go into next year with whoever they get for Trocheck shoehorned into a top 6 role. They're going to hope that Perreault can continue to develop, that Zibanejad can stave off the aging curve, that JT Miller can stave off the aging curve, and one of the magic beans from their bottom 9 can become a top sixer, the overqualified guy, whether that's Cooley or Laba, whatever. None of those guys scream top six player to me. The Rangers are in rough shape. We didn't really get to talk about the Leafs. We'll probably do that next week, but that will do it for this week's Theory of Hockey show. Be sure to play Do You Know Puck and The Journey over at theoryofhockey.com. Subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts or over on YouTube. Subscribe to the Substack. The links for everything are down in the show notes. I will talk to you guys real soon. Until then, enjoy the Stanley Cup playoffs. And if I had to handicap it right now, I do think we're getting Carolina, Colorado as a Stanley Cup final, and we get the Marty Necas Revenge Stanley Cup final. I'll talk to you guys real soon.